food insecurity solutions are not actually food-based. It's not about we don't have enough food. It's about the structures where people cannot get that food.
Hi, welcome back. Welcome back to our podcast, The Zero Hunger Project. I'm your host, Suman.
I'm Stacia.
And today we are going to talk about food sovereignty in Canada, equity, policy, and the power of community voice. Mm-hmm. And who do we have today?
Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Marissa Alexander. Marissa is the co-executive director of Food Secure Canada, a national alliance of organizations and individuals working to advance food sovereignty, climate justice, and equitable access to nutritious food. The organization brings together farmers, Indigenous leaders, researchers, youth, and community advocates to build a more just, sustainable, and healthy food system. Under Marissa's leadership, Food Secure Canada continues to advocate for the right to food, the decolonization of food systems, and the development of a universal healthy school food program through its coordination of the Coalition for Healthy School Food. The organization's policy platform is grounded in community-led solutions with a strong commitment to centering Black, Indigenous, and low-income communities in national policy discussions, recognizing that those most impacted by food security must lead the transformation. Food Secure Canada has played a key role in shaping Canadian food policy, from contributing to the Food Policy for Canada to influencing federal conversations on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, which is what we've been talking about. Their work also affirms the inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples, and they remain committed to supporting self-determination and sovereignty while working on unceded territories of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. This episode explores what it means to fight for sovereignty instead of charity, community over profit, and systems change over short-term fixes, principles that define Marissa's work and Food Secure Canada's ongoing movement building. So that's just all, it's badass. It's all badassery all the time. Like, how do you feel when somebody reads something like that about you? Doesn't that make you feel like wicked?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice when you list all those things back to back. It sounds really great. It does sound overwhelming. I'm like, oh my gosh, wow, that is a lot of work. I'm tired.
Yeah, I bet.
And Marissa, I can get that. And my personal journey, I've been following and loosely associated with Food Secure Canada for years, probably a decade. Mm-hmm. And the work that Food Secure Canada does is so important to have this conversation in Canada. So I'm really very thankful that you have agreed to come here and talk a little bit about that. It means a lot to us.
Thank you for having me. No, I'm more than happy to be here, and I love talking about this because I love the work. So happy to be here.
That's amazing. So I'm going to dive right in. You lead an organization that sees food as a human right, not just a commodity. Now, how does that principle shape up the advocacy and partnerships that you pursue?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the big pieces about viewing food as a human right and not a commodity is really around removing a lot of that stigma related to who should and shouldn't get food or who is deserving of food, and recognizing that it is not something that we should be using in discussions around, power and value and who gets to eat. That's not for us to decide. Food is a human right. And so we have to treat it as such. And I think that also allows us to advocate at the right levels, I think. So acknowledging that it's not the individual person's responsibility to fight against household food insecurity. It's not an individual issue. It really is a systemic issue that needs systemic solutions. And I think that's where FSE tries to focus our work and our advocacy is at that systems level, and removing that sort of charity donation model where certain people are deserving of certain quality of food and others are deserving of a different quality. None of us are more or less deserving. It's a human right that we should all have access to.
We talk a lot about on this podcast about how hunger is political, and how food security has been weaponized. And I'm interested if you could speak a little bit about what food sovereignty means within a Canadian context and how it's different from just objectively fighting food insecurity.
Yeah, it's such an interesting concept, because I think food sovereignty means something different to every single person, to every single community, to the region that you're a part of. It's going to mean something very different. Different cultures view food sovereignty as very different, and so when we speak about food sovereignty, I think we have to acknowledge that Indigenous food sovereignty is going to look very different than Black food sovereignty. And so it's not a one size fits all. What it really is working towards allowing folks the ability to engage in food systems and access the food that they want to access in a healthful, just, and sustainable way. It's not just making sure people are quote unquote eating enough. It's about making sure that they are a part of that food system in a way that is meaningful and valuable for them. And most definitions of food sovereignty include food security within them as an important piece. Some definitions of food security include food sovereignty within them, and I think it's, we can get really deep into like the linguistics of it all, but I think bottom line is we're all trying to say the same thing, that it's not just about food and getting enough food. It's a bigger piece that is really situated within the context that the world is in. So it has to be sustainable on an individual level. People have to continue to be able to get the food that they are interested in or that's culturally appropriate. It has to be sustainable on a community level. It has to be something that community can continue to access. And then it has to be sustainable on a global level as well. So we can't be pillaging the earth to feed certain people. We have to be looking in that seventh generation thinking around what are we doing now that is impacting food sovereignty 7 generations down the line.
That's one of the comments that we've heard again and again is about cultural relativity and how everything is relative to its own culture. And if you are going to call yourself a food sovereign nation, that you really need to recognize that there are many different cultures, particularly in the north, and a lot of disenfranchised, marginalized populations are all culture heavy and need to have their cultures recognized if they're going to get fed. And that's such an integral part of maintaining a community's autonomy and integrity and self-preservation and motivation to move forward in and participate in bigger communities if they're being honored and recognized for their own individuality. So I really think that's a point that can't be overstated.
It's such a part of food insecurity.
Yeah, sorry. I know I was just going to add to that I also think there's something to be said around recognizing that even a food sovereign nation, like if you were thinking about Canada as a food sovereign nation, there's multiple nations within that title, and that like not all of those nations recognize each other. So that's also a challenging piece to integrate as well.
Well, there's colonization involved in that. There's all kinds of other discussions that are part of the subtext of those conversations that make these really challenging.
So Marissa, do you consider Canada as a food sovereign nation?
No, not at all. Absolutely not. Unfortunately, not. I think that if 50% of Black folks are living with household food insecurity in Canada, then we're not sovereign. We're not food secure. I think, again, it's that idea of who are we looking at? Certain people might consider themselves very food sovereign and very food secure, but a large majority of people are not. So we are absolutely not.
And we're not even scratching the tip of the iceberg with our Indigenous peoples in this country.
Well, and I think also this is a comment that I've said over and over again. My background is in sociology, so I'm constantly talking about this, but it's expecting people to flourish inside of systems of power that weren't created for them. So we need to make sure that, when we're having these conversations and we're putting these types of labels on things, that we're considering the breadth and scope of the community that we're describing before we get all excited about the fact that we're sovereign or we have equality or parity or any of those big sort of social construct words we like to slap on stuff. Right? Like, who are you actually talking about? Do you know who you're talking about? Are you just talking about a small percentage of the population? Or are you talking about all of our population? Because that's a different conversation.
Even the majority.
Yeah.
But that's not. So I'm going to shift the gear a little bit because this is something that's really very close to my heart, and I can imagine that it is probably very close to Food Secure Canada's heart, is the school food policy and the school food program. Uh, Over the last quite a few years, Food Secure Canada has heavily invested some resources, time, and very successfully worked on the school food program file. Why was it so important for Food Secure Canada to lead that conversation?
Yeah, and I will just make sure to shout out the Coalition for Healthy School Food. Yeah, I was housed at FSC for 10 years, and so it was a really big part of the work that we do. But that coalition itself is also like a powerhouse on its own. And so acknowledging that, yes, FSC, we're very proud and we're very passionate and we care a lot about it. But we also want to just note that the folks working as a part of that coalition have also been doing so much work. And it's important for a lot of reasons. It's, I mean, 10 years in the making, this bill and this funding, and I think one of the big reasons is that we know that there are so many students and children living with household food insecurity. We know that a school food program is not the ultimate solution to household food insecurity. Those are going to be income-based solutions. But we also know that right now, the students that are in these situations, providing a school food program is sometimes confirming that they get 1 or 2 meals that they wouldn't have been able to have that day. And that makes a huge impact on obviously that individual child's life, but also on like the healthcare system, on the education system. It's setting up children for success in so many different ways because we know there are so many negative impacts of living with household food insecurity, especially on growing minds and growing people. But we also see it as a very important tool that is standing on some of the pieces that we have been advocating around, such as like local food systems or culturally appropriate food systems. The school food policy and advocating for that is really important because we are also advocating that each province and territory is independently partnering with local foods, local food systems, local food procurement, culturally appropriate food procurement. So instead of sort of a one size fits all, we all get our food from a large company that's based in Ontario. Instead, we're looking at developing food systems within smaller communities. And that we know is something that moves towards food sovereignty on a bigger scale for a lot of people. Right now, as we know, with the tariffs coming in, there's a lot of big shifts in our food chain. We're trying to shift towards a food web where there are different ways that people can engage with those food systems that allow more consistency for local farmers and people of color and people in community, as opposed to putting it all towards these large corporations.
And I think, again, that's a topic that we talk about a lot, is decentralizing these systems and trying to break them up into sort of more community-based infrastructure. Can you talk about an example of where that's been successful, that has really had a systemic impact?
One of the big sort of community focused things that we do that we see a large impact in is the Eat, Think, Vote campaign. So it is a campaign that is, coast to coast to coast, and we really encourage folks at their local community level to engage with candidates prior to an election. And we encourage and support that by providing all of the resources and information around holding an event, questions you might ask, policies that you might be curious about exploring or advocating for that kind of align with what you are hoping for in your community. And the individual folks and civil society members are able to then engage with potential candidates and decide for themselves who might be the best person who has their best interest prioritized, and then vote accordingly. And what we have found is that connection between sort of that local engagement and then like federal impact is very, very strong. It shows a lot of folks just how it kind of breaks down this idea of, oh, I'm one individual person in this massive, massive country. How am I possibly going to influence everything? And it breaks it down. And then we've had reports of successful candidates who have then been elected and have gone on to sit in government and have said, okay, we heard about Eat, Think, Vote. We know that people are really passionate about food. What are we going to do? And so I think that type of grassroots, on the ground, community-led work that then translate to systemic change is exactly what FSC is trying to encourage. And this idea of all working sort of together towards similar goals, because I think that whether you are passionate about healthcare or farming or production or other layers within food sectors and food systems, a lot of the solutions and the policies are beneficial for a lot of those folks. And so we don't have to look at it as like fighting for the last piece of pie, when I think that we could be building a better version of the pie in the first place.
Very well said. So we often hear about the role of philanthropy in hunger. We all have working in the charity sector. Now, what are its limitations? And according to you, how can governments take stronger responsibilities?
We know that the charitable model doesn't work. And I think it comes back to the piece that we've been talking about around using food as a tool as opposed to viewing it as a human right. And so I think if we're constantly looking at it as something that needs to be based on, donations, the philanthropic sector just happens to be interested in at that time, we're never going to be able to make change meaningfully or sustainably.
And they're also grounded in colonial wealth systems, like that, right? From the ground up, it's problematic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This idea of, there are people who have the answers, they have the capacity and the passion to do it. They just do not have the funding. And then the people sort of up here in the hierarchy who have money, who are deciding who gets to do what project. And it's often for very short periods of time. So there's sort of this like hurry up and wait where you're supposed to be building out an entire structure to help folks in your community, whether that's a small community, a bigger community, across provincial territorial lines. But you have to basically do it all very, very quickly with this hope and understanding that you may not have funding to continue. And so it leads to a lot of burnout, obviously, because there's only so long that you want to stay in a career path where you don't know if you'll have a job in the next couple months and you're putting your all into something and then maybe nothing happens. And then I think there's also a piece around, the philanthropic sector shifts based on the context. And so we can kind of see it now where diversity, equity, inclusion, Indigenous folks, all of that Indigenous focused and led work was all really amplified for the past little bit. And now a lot of that funding is being pulled because of what's happening down south. And where folks are looking for sort of these easy wins, like show me how many people you fed in a very small amount. We had one funder tell us, you're trying to help too many people. Can you just narrow it down to one group or one community? And so
how do you not get discouraged with stuff like that? Because I would get fired from my job. I'd be like, oh, just one moment, please. I have a few things I need to tell you that are totally off the record and unprintable. Like, how do you manage that? That must be incredibly discouraging.
It is. It's extremely discouraging, especially since, what we're trying to do is not that wild.
No, and also you're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which seem to me to be three fundamental human rights that people have now decided are unpopular, and therefore they're going to move off into something else. Like, that's the kind of stuff that I don't understand how people overcome. How do you have the tenacity to stay in the room having conversations with people when they're talking about stuff like that?
Because I have to. Because it impacts me on, like, as a professional doing this work. It impacts my community, BIPOC folks, queer folks, neurodiverse folks, marginalized folks. All of those people need us to continue. And so it's not easy. There's a lot of days where I'm like, oh man, if I had just gone into, tech, I'd probably have a lot of money. But, it's very hard to exist in this world and not think about what am I doing to make it better for the people who are coming after me, for me. And I think that's what keeps me there, but it's definitely not easy because it is constantly frustrating because it feels like we have all these great ideas. And like I said, there's no shortness of people who want to do the work, who are really passionate about it. And we're all just sitting here going, please give us funding so we can survive to do this work, so we don't have to do it off the side of our desks. And again, I also think that when we talk about funding, people are like, oh, we're asking for so much. We're asking for peanuts, and the amount of work that we can do on such a small budget, it's not good, but it's very impressive. We can do a lot with very little. And I think that's also the frustrating part, is that it constantly feels like we're trying to say, how do we paint this picture better so people understand how important this work is? And we spend a lot of time trying to market ourselves when we could be spending that time actually advocating, making change, impacting people's lives.
Well, on top of which, we've made it your responsibility to make us feel better about the fact that you're being marginalized. So we're expecting you to drive a car on a road that you're currently building. So there's that.
And Marissa, I'll tell you, very recently I was at a conference, and there was an hour-and-a-half panel with 5 CEOs from top companies around North American world. And for an hour and a half, all I heard is how they are being so supportive of food insecurity because they donate pallets of food to the people who need. And that is where it ended. And it was frustrating for me, knowing that this is not, of course, a solution that we all understand, but how top CEOs are thinking that they are doing their part by just donating pallets of food. What would you have to tell them?
How do you get them to change their mindset?
Exactly. $1 million question.
Yeah, well, first I need to trap them in a room and show them a long PowerPoint. I think it's not a unique perspective. Like the government is also kind of operating that way, where they're donating a lot of money to food banks and then being like, oh, pat ourselves on the back, we did it, we fixed food security, right? And so I think it's a fundamental systemic change in that we have to have the conversation about food insecurity solutions are not actually food based. It's not about we don't have enough food. It's about the structures where people cannot get that food. And so talking about, okay, again, we need income solutions. We need long-term stability. We need social supports. We need to be addressing like migrant workers and stop in basically like modern day enslaving folks for this food that a lot of it is going to waste. And so I think being really mindful of not falling into that trap, a lot of like greenwashing of like, we're rescuing food and giving it to the poor. Good for us. We get a tax break, or we're doing things that are more climate, environmentally sustainable to make our food, but you're still doing it within this very capitalist structure, and you're still doing it to excess, and it's still not meeting the needs of the actual individual peoples living with household food insecurity. And so I think that's that shift and that gap. And I think that there's a lot of folks saying the same thing, but fundamentally our government is quite siloed. We have different departments for different topics. And until we recognize that things like a food policy cannot exist only in one department, it has to exist across the different departments, because it cannot just be about agriculture. It needs to also be about health and poverty and family wellness. We're going to have these constant challenges of people not recognizing how integrated all of these issues are.
And about food distribution and sustainability and, like the road system, infrastructure, all of those things are conversations that need to be had. We were learning early on about agri-food systems and how it's not just about the farmer in the field. It's about how food goes from being grown to showing up on somebody's plate. And we've been talking about that from the very beginning. And I think that's a huge part of the conversation that people don't really understand. They think, oh, I'm just going to give, a bag of groceries or write a check or whatever. This is a much bigger problem, much more far-reaching that requires top-down thinking, but it also needs community upsurgence. So tell me how you catalyze the kids. How do you get How do you get more women involved in these things? How do you get more
You,
marginalized populations, BIPOC, all of these people into this conversation?
They're already in it. They're in the conversation, they're just not being heard.
How do you get them heard?
Yeah, that's the piece there, is using our power and positions to uplift the right voices. Because I think we know that, historically, BIPOC voices and BIPOC food systems and relationships with food are different and are a lot of them anti-colonial, which is sort of the answer to a lot of our challenges and our current food system challenges. And I think there are folks doing that, and connecting and creating food systems that are more sustainable and are more responsible, but they don't have necessarily the funding to continue to do it, the infrastructure to continue to do it, or the voices, or being able to be heard by the people who are making change. And so I think that's the challenge, is how do we use our platform to uplift the right voices so that those voices can be heard and impact change without taking up that space, but also recognizing that we're encouraging folks who, as we've talked about, are carrying a lot of that burden and doing a lot of that work to go into a space where they're not necessarily ready to hear some of the suggestions or the changes, or to recognize that the current system is very, very harmful. And we're asking them to, suggest changes, but we're not prepared necessarily at that systemic level to make those changes. We want to hear a certain percentage, and then we want to, do maybe a little bit of it and then pat ourselves on the back for having heard it. And I think that whole system needs to change. And a lot of that is just like constantly using our voice or our platform to uplift folks who don't have that voice.
It's predicated on the idea that somebody who's benefiting from these systems is willing to let go of these systems for the greater good. And that is a big swing, right? I mean, that's a big ask. But we have talked about from the very beginning how the two ways, because so many people feel disenfranchised when it comes to looking at stuff like that. Like you're looking at a whole system of oppression that needs to come apart before these things can kind of float to the surface. And for the average person, that seems pretty daunting. Like it's probably not going to happen today, and tomorrow's not looking good either. Right? Like in the meantime, what do we do? And what we said from the jump is there are two ways you can influence your surroundings, and one is with your vote, and the other one is with your wallet. And if you put steady pressure on people through those two mediums, the hope is that at some point, there will be a groundswell of people. And as you say, that will then change policy. But it seems slow moving. It feels excruciatingly slow.
Yeah, and it is. It absolutely is, especially if you are thinking about how many people are being harmed, who are hungry, who are living with household food insecurity every day. And we're like, okay, good. We're working on advocacy that's been going on for 25 years without, like you said, a clear, exciting change anytime soon. It's really tough to do that. And I like your idea, or your two ways of impacting. I similarly frame it as like, what is your scope of change? And I think that everybody has a scope of change. It's just, some people's scope of change is quite a bit bigger. We'll call it scope of influence. Some people's is a lot bigger because they have a bigger platform. Maybe they have a bigger audience. They have maybe a role that is quote unquote higher up, versus folks that maybe your scope of influence is, like you said, your vote or what you're funding, or maybe it's about educating the people around you about the intersectionality of things. And maybe it's just about recognizing problematic statements and addressing it and saying, hey, I don't think you meant to do that. But when you say things like that, you're insinuating that this, and this. And I think we can kind of work to have a bigger scope of influence as we get into positions that have and hold more influence. But it doesn't mean that we don't still need every single person advocating at their little level, regardless of where that is.
And that it's predicated on people in power being willing to share that power, being willing to open and hear different versions of success than what they thought previously was successful. And I think that's where you have to keep hammering on doors and just, kind of screaming at the top of your lungs to get people to kind of rescind that power so that there's more space at the top for different voices.
So Addressing, we just talked about policy. Where are we with Canada's food policy? I have to ask you that question.
How's it going?
Yeah, how's it going?
So Canada's food policy, as we know, was created in 2019. And then we did at FSC, we were asked to do a town hall in 2023 that kind of encouraged and got feedback from folks around a potential update or any improvements or things that we would encourage to be changed. And then nothing really happened for a while as far as we know. And that's not to say that there's not stuff happening in the background. I'm not sure. But as far as we know, not a lot has changed. That policy is there. It's just a matter of now what are we doing with it and how are we ensuring that it actually is like an evergreen document that is ongoing and changing and adapting. And again, I think one of the challenges is that it's in the agriculture and agri-foods portfolio. And that's really tricky. That's really tricky to keep having those conversations, especially since, as we've kind of been alluding to, there's a lot of big players, big corporations that have a lot of power in that sector, that it's not necessarily the most beneficial for them to let go of those powers.
100%. So if you leave that out for a second and say, somebody comes to you and says, Marissa, you're going to be the prime minister for half a day. Forget about Minister of Agriculture. What are the 3 values or principles that you would negotiate for our national food policy? Top 3.
So I think one of the big ones is, there's so many, but I will say one of the big ones would be, as I've kind of mentioned, like it has to be interdepartmental. It cannot be siloed. It has to span across the entire government departments, all of the ones that are influenced by food security, food sovereignty, and
Which is basically everybody, frankly. It's everybody.
I'm like, who isn't impacted by food? No one that I've met so far. But my eyes are open. Well, maybe there is some folks who are surviving without, but for the most part, that it has to be something that's intersectional and intersectoral, and it's inclusive. I think picking only 3 is hard. Well, I'm like, great. Do we have 10?
I don't think 4 makes a difference. I think she's like 3 or 500.
Yes.
4 is not going to cut it.
Got it.
I don't think. If 3 is not going to do it, 4 is not going to do it.
Exactly.
How about 1,000? You have half a day though, so maybe get some snacks.
Well, that's exactly it. I have some time, so I think another big piece is making it something that is like a permanent structure. So it cannot be something that is like 2019 for the first food policy is wild.
I was like, I'm waiting for the opportunity to reiterate for people who don't know. 2019 was when this country developed a national food policy. That is absurd. We were interviewing a minister in Finland who talked about setting up a school food program in the 40s during the war. They managed to do that. And we can't even do anything in 2019. They put a probe on Mars and we still don't have a national food policy. Like I find that like just shocking. So anyway, once you get past that, what are you going to do about it?
It is so shocking. It really is.
But it's not being implemented properly, even in 2025.
No, let's call somebody right now. Like, who can we call right now? Marissa, get your phone book out and let's call somebody.
The Prime Minister of Canada.
Okay, well, let's call him. Let's call the new guy and see what he's doing.
Do we have his number? Get him on the call.
Got it. Suman's connected. He's part of he does UN stuff. He must know.
There you go. No, but I do think that's huge, right? The fact that it's sort of like a sidelined thing that people are thinking isn't a priority is wild to me. So it needs to be like a permanent structure. And I think things like the healthy school food policy are sort of like examples of how we can anchor it, because once we are implementing the actual work, and again, keeping in mind that funding just got approved for 2025, right? So like 2019, 2020, it's still not great. And we're one of the only, I think, G7 countries that did not have a national.
I've learned we were the last G7 country.
Yeah, that didn't have one. So to me, again, there's so many global examples of successful food policies and national school food programs that there's not really an excuse for us not to like, well, we don't know how to do it. Yes, we are in a different context.
Yeah,
Canada
figuring
is
out.
very, very big. We have a lot of different like you know, atmospheres, like literally depending on where you live, you're in a completely different like biodiverse area. And so you no, we can't have one system or one policy that works for everybody, but no one's asking for that. We're asking for policies that allow for that variation in what people need.
And also to go back to this guest that we were just talking to, who made the very bold statement, we don't need to continue innovating. We need to start operationalizing on our innovations. Like we already have, there's enough food on this planet to feed everybody.
Yeah.
So that's
Yes,
not
implement
the
it.
issue,
Yes.
Exactly.
right? It's how do we implement these ideas that have already been tested and sort of made culturally relevant and all of those things. How do we just pull the plug and get going?
Yeah, and I think the reason that it is so challenging is, as we've already mentioned, because a lot of people would have to lose a lot of power and money for us to implement things that are more beneficial for like the general public and civil society and Joe Blow down the street. A lot of big corporations would have to let go of a lot of stuff and a lot of control.
100%.
And we can't allow our politics to be controlled by special interest groups if we're going to get anywhere. So I get to ask these two questions of everybody when we interview them, and I feel like for you in particular, you're going to have a lot of answers to this. The first one is, what are the conversations we're not having? And it seems like we're not having more conversations than we are having. So what is the point that we're missing in all of this? Like, what are the things where, later on in the afternoon, you're going to be like, shoot, I wish I brought that up first thing. And then my second question, and I ask them in conjunction because often they dovetail each other, is what is your pie in the sky best case scenario?
Okay, so I think that, yeah, there's a lot of conversations that we've touched on that we're not having. I think a really big one that I would want to highlight, because I do want to end with some sense of hope as opposed to this, like, it's all really bad, because
this rage against the machine, pitchforks and torches, which I'm kind of here for, to be honest, but I get it. Yeah.
Short of being like, oh yeah, we like just, burn it down, start from scratch, like that's not going to happen. So with that reality, I think, as I kind of mentioned before, a lot of folks that are advocating for change, specifically policy change and structural change, are advocating for things that would benefit each other. So folks that are talking about, the current migrant worker, foreign worker system is problematic. It's very challenging. It's very, it's getting real close to modern day slavery. Those folks are advocating for that change, and that change would benefit our food system, right? So it would benefit, yes, we are taking advantage currently, unfortunately, of people, specifically migrant workers, who come and do a lot of our harvesting and part of our food system. But if we were to make that a more sustainable system, it would also impact farmers in a very positive way, which would then impact the ability to produce foods in a more sustainable way, which would then impact the household food insecurity. The same way that is if we come at it from like a health perspective, making healthful foods more accessible for everybody would impact positively our healthcare system. We have a lot of burnt out healthcare workers. If we work backwards, we know that having, food security, culturally relevant foods, a good relationship with food and community impacts so many aspects of health. So I think instead of looking at it as sort of separate issues that are a little bit related, I think we need to think about how do we all come together and advocate almost as like a bigger whole for this vision that we want to see. And so I think that's the kind of thing that I think we are historically not looking at. And I think that's on purpose, right? Because we know that in like a patriarchal colonial society, it's a lot easier to say there's only a little bit of space. Exactly. There's only a little bit of space for your voice, to fight amongst yourselves and then decide who's more important and then come talk to us. as opposed to recognizing that a lot of us are on the same page here.
Well, and on top of which, even if, I've said this in an earlier podcast episode, but even if you don't care about people unilaterally, even if you're sitting up in a house somewhere where you've got piles of all the stuff that you need and you don't care about anyone that's around you, these enhancements will improve your life also. It's going to enhance healthcare. It's going to generate more food. It's going to increase your quality of life in addition to everybody else's. So even if you only care about yourself, this is going to help you.
Yes, absolutely. It's this idea of like curb cut solutions, right? Where when we put curb cuts in, which is literally the piece in the curb where it goes down to make it more accessible for people who are, in a wheelchair, but then we all realized, oh wait, everybody's using these because it's easier for all of us. It's easier for people with strollers. It's easier for anyone with mobility issues. It's easier for people who need, all of these solutions are beneficial for all of us. It's just a matter of, we have to actually advocate for those changes and recognize that we can, I think, come to a version of our current system that is a lot more healthful, just, and sustainable.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad you're having this conversation because Food Secure Canada is in such a great position to have these conversations, and with your leadership, I think we are in good hands. No pressure, Marissa. No pressure at all.
What is your pie in the sky best case scenario?
And I think that's kind of where it's leading into is pie in the sky is this vision of civil society having a big voice in what happens for the future of what we do. And I think FSE is really more meaningfully building that sort of network of networks, coalition, alliance model so that we can advocate for that. Because I do think that bottom line is like government does need the population and civil society. Like they do work for us. And so when we say this isn't working, especially on a grand scale, they kind of have to listen or they don't get to continue to do their job. And so I think recognizing that, yes, they are decision makers and they are technically sort of in positions of power in our current structure, it doesn't mean that they don't need us just as much or more than we need them. And so when we come together, I think we can influence in a really positive way. I think the Food Policy Advisory Council was a great idea. There's a lot of flaws in how it actually rolled out. But again, having a space where people across food sectors and systems can voice their opinions is important and valuable. And I think at this point at FSE, we're like, okay, well, let's just do that outside of government until we figure out what's happening with that. Or maybe we'll just continue to bring all those voices together so that we have a clear place to go when government is ready to listen.
Mm-hmm. Or the alternative is we voted you in and we can vote you out.
Eat, think, vote.
Exactly.
One of my favorite programs from Food Secure Canada. But we're going to wrap it up. We had a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time. This was so insightful. And I'm very hopeful for what's next coming from Food Secure Canada.
Yeah, you're an absolute rock star.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for your time.
Take care.
Is nothing short of a badass.
Badass. I loved her so much.
Wow. And I've followed Food Secure Canada for such a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It went through a lot of changes.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm so happy to see you in a place where they have landed right now.
Mm-hmm.
Food Secure Canada has certainly had a super success with the coalition of school food.
Yeah.
And actually demonstrated that last year with the school food policy.
Mm-hmm.
And the direction and the thought process the team has, it's amazing.
Yeah, and I really, for me, it's a question of always wondering how people who work in these spaces have the energy and the drive and the determination to keep going against like pretty overwhelming odds. And I thought it was really sobering for her to just say simply, I do this because I have to keep doing it. You're talking about me, you're talking about my family, you're talking about the people I care about, you're talking about my communities, you're talking about marginalized populations inside of the great country of Canada, which we adore and we're proud to be citizens. There are still major cracks in the infrastructure, and there are people that are falling through those cracks in a country that's purportedly has a social safety net, that there are still people that are really suffering, and those people are the ones that are also doing the advocacy work. So, that's where other people need to step in who have more privilege and who have more reach and who have more access to sort of advocate on behalf of people like Marissa who are in
I
the
don't know. I
trenches.
kind of really toil with that piece a little.
Why?
When we hear about poverty and hunger,
Mm-hmm.
often the people talking about is the people of privilege, who has no idea what hunger and poverty really means.
Right.
When I have CEO of a multinational company sitting in talk saying, I've done my part, I give hundreds of kids of food, that is not dealing with poverty
But
and
that's
hunger.
that's not what I'm
But
talking
that is a
about.
privilege.
Those are people who are paying lip service. I'm not
Exactly.
talking about those people. I'm talking people that are really boots on the ground, willing to exercise their leverage and their privilege and their authority to make spaces for people like the Marissas of the world to have a platform to talk about their own communities in a culturally
100%.
relative way. That's what I'm talking about.
That I totally
I'm not
agree.
talking about some stuffed
No.
shirt getting a
Yeah.
soundbite on the
Okay.
news about what they're doing to help global, because that's bullshit,
Yeah,
frankly,
and
and
I-
we know it.
And kind of one thing that it was great to hear from Marissa, which not that we didn't know about, all of us know about those who are in the sector,
Mm-hmm.
is Canada food sovereign? The answer was blank, no.
Well, and it's not because it's a collection of nations. It's not one single nation to begin with. So by definition, it is.
No, but there is possibility of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
It is a political will
Mm-hmm.
more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to hear this loud and clear from everybody around the table to say, no, we are not.
Mm-hmm.
We are a developed country. We are
Mhm.
so-called, we have, as you mentioned, social safety net.
Mm-hmm.
We have enough resources, natural and otherwise,
Mm-hmm.
but still we do not prioritize food as a basic human right.
No, which I just find astonishing.
And it's been over almost 60 years now that we have called food as a human right in
Mhm.
Canada,
Mm-hmm.
but still we don't.
So what's the hang up? I mean, why? How long is a piece of string? But what is the deal? What's the deal?
I think the deal is we are politically motivated, and it is not of our interest to really understand food as a human right.
Is it of our interest as a nation of nations to have a section of our population starving so that they can't advance, that we can't advance our country on the global stage? I mean, is it in our political interest to have that happen?
So I think the first and foremost that I see is most of the countries like Canada, UK, France, US, all of these kind of developed, rich countries, so-called,
Yeah.
we don't really want to recognize our problem. That is the first and foremost. We can never find a solution if we don't recognize the problem.
Yeah.
Even till today, when you talk about hunger and poverty, the first impression that anybody gives you is that poor kid on the side of the street in Africa,
Yeah.
and you can count his rib cage and he's got a bowl of empty.
Yeah.
But what they are not talking about, my next door neighbor doesn't have enough food to eat.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we have food bank, 8,500 people standing in line every week to access food. And we are in Canada, we are in Toronto.
Yeah.
So unless and until we really recognize the problem, we will never find a solution.
And the problem with that is that the system is only broken for a certain percentage of the population. There's a subsect of the population for whom the system is just fine, thank you very much. And they are the decision makers, and they're the ones that are currently holding the purse strings, and they're, cradling the special interest groups. They are the special interest groups. And so, as much as we're talking about hunger, we can also replace hunger with poverty, with gender equity,
Housing,
with
all of that.
housing, with diversity and inclusion, with, a whole bunch of other things that serve the greater good. And somehow, because we are all operating under this system of power that was created by and for, I keep hammering on about this, but it's still true, created by and for a particular subset of the population.
100%.
Those are the decision makers, and these things don't affect those people.
100%.
So until we
Or they affect in a positive way.
Sure. Oh yeah. Oh no.
So you can't forget that.
Absolutely.
It certainly does.
Certainly does.
Yeah.
I mean, in a negative way, that they're not being harmed by the lack of these things.
Exactly.
Until that changes. So what do? We ride
Look
it
at
down,
in the-
Simon? Like, what are we
But
doing?
look at what happened in the last couple of years in Canada in the grocery stores.
Mhm.
With inflation, food prices going up, who made those profits?
Well, and how about increasing the price of bread and then getting
Exactly.
a coupon? Sorry, we oppressed you. Here's a coupon.
And even we talk about greenwashing.
Yeah,
You go to a grocery store, they're charging for bags because they want you to bring.
yeah.
where is that money going?
Yep. And the bags that we're buying aren't biodegradable, by
No.
the way. So they're all
Exactly.
going into the landfill.
Exactly. We are talking about greedflation.
Yeah.
It is a real thing, and
Yeah.
we have seen that.
Yeah.
We have a grocery code of conduct in Canada very recently, and honestly, I think it is a joke.
Like, here's the thing that really kind of sticks in my craw, and it goes back to the conversation we were having with Marissa about the fact that the National Food Program started in 2019. We have a grocery code of conduct that, like, all of these things seem to be recent innovations, and they all seem to be gutless.
That's it. Like, it has no teeth.
Yeah.
It is absolutely no teeth. The grocery code of conduct, I honestly think it's a joke.
Yeah.
There is so much more that we could have done. We had the opportunity to, but we chose not to for various reasons.
Yeah.
I am not talking about the reasons because I'm not in that shoe
Yeah.
to be able to say that, but it is not enough.
Right.
And if we continue by just putting a check next to a box because we have a grocery code of conduct, we have a national food policy, but it does nothing.
Yeah. And who can we call about this? I mean, who are the grown-ups in the room that are going to sit down and say, you know what, we screwed that up. We didn't deliver on something that
I think there needs to be a motivation. The motivation
There is
is
no
what it
motivation.
doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And that is the problem. Because we are not holding our governments accountable for food issues, for
Well,
poverty issues,
how do you hold your government accountable for food issues?
the day of election.
Okay.
That is the only way. And Marissa talked about Eat, Think, Vote,
Yeah.
which is fantastic. I wish and I hope that everybody embraces that
Yeah.
Eat, Think, Vote, because at the end of the day, if we bombard the people who are running for office talking about food insecurity, poverty, and housing, when they get into office, they will make a difference.
Right. So that's your call to action: food, housing, poverty. Get out there and start talking to people about them and force change. That's the only way we can do it. If we all sit around and, we're chasing windmills at this point, right? If we don't
100%.
actually do something about the things that we're talking about, then what is the point of any of this?
And this summer or this fall, whenever you're meeting your MP, doing a barbecue in the community, or showing up to shake hands and kiss babies, ask them the question.
Or email them right now. Like, what are you
Exactly.
doing right now? Get on your phone, send them an email, tweet. The thing is, public shaming.
X, not tweet anymore.
Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
Shows how in the loop I am. Anyway, and also, never mind. I was just about to go on a whole other tangent, which I just censored myself in real time.
Good.
Thank you. Get online and hold people accountable. Hold people's feet to the fire. Have these conversations. I have conversations with people all the time who find out I'm in this podcast with you, and they're like, well, what can we do on an individual level? You can be outraged publicly. You can be publicly outraged about this stuff and talk about it until people are like, ugh, I can't believe we stop talking about it. But it needs to be talked about because there are so many people that are suffering under the hand of silence.
And if anything has shown us in the last federal election in Canada, there has been ridings where people won by one vote.
Yeah.
So everybody's vote counts. Your vote counts.
Yeah.
Everybody's vote counts. And you need to vote, and you need to vote with your wallet as well.
That's right. Because look what we did with the states.
100%.
What
And
we
we
continue
don't
to
want
do
that.
with the states.
So come on out, because together we will have a hunger-free world.